So far, we've limited our feathers to blocks and skinnier borders and sashings. Now it's time to set them free in bigger borders and backgrounds. Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters from QuiltingIsMyTherapy.com, and welcome to the fourth video in the Feathers, Blocks, Borders, and Backgrounds Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along video series. Throughout the last few videos, we've been learning how to quilt feathers in a lot of different areas of our quilts. We've learned designs that are perfect for skinny sashings and borders, as well as how to use feathers in blocks of all sizes and shapes. If you haven't already checked out those previous videos, be sure to do that. Now we're going to explore how to use feathers as an all-over design to add a gorgeous look of texture and beauty to your quilting. We're going to learn several different designs that work perfect in those background areas. Then we're going to learn how to adapt them and turn them into border designs. First, we'll talk through the Meandering Paisley design, which is perfect for beginner quilters as a way to tiptoe into those feather designs. Then we'll see how to adapt that shape for borders by quilting scooped feathers in those areas. Then we're going to touch on a versatile, stunning design that's perfect for all kinds of areas on your quilts, the feather meander. I'm going to show you how it goes together, how to create some variations, as well as how to quilt them in the borders of your quilts. And I'm going to be demonstrating the designs on this custom panel I designed just for the video series. To learn more about the video series or to get the custom products, all you have to do is click the link in the description box below or visit QuiltingIsMyTherapy.com. So let's get to it. For the first design, we're going to incorporate a meandering line that throws in a Paisley shape. This is perfect for newer quilters that want to tiptoe into quilting that feathery kind of shape, or for areas where you just want to get it done. I'm going to start by quilting a line that meanders around in all different directions. Now at a random point, I'm going to pause and quilt a Paisley. Now a Paisley is very similar to that half heart shape that we've been quilting on the feathers, but it also kind of looks like a teardrop. But regardless of what I think it looks like, I'm going to quilt that line that curves out and back towards my line. Once I'm finished with that, I can resume quilting that meandering line. And I'm going to keep doing that, quilting my meandering line, throwing in those Paisleys, filling in that area as consistently as possible. Now depending on how you prefer to quilt, you might have more Paisleys, you might have more meandering lines, either one is totally fine. The most important thing here is that I want to fill in this whole area as much as possible without leaving big gaps in the quilting. But one thing I love about this design is as you learn how to quilt it, you can change it up by throwing in multiple Paisleys, by throwing in some swirls, by really throwing in any design. And if you really want to make that Paisley pop, you can add some echoing around it before you move on. Now one thing to consider when quilting a background filler such as this is how dense do you want the quilting? The density of the quilting is determined by the spacing between the lines. So if you like to quilt things to death like I do, quilt your lines closer together. Or if you want softer, less dense quilting, something that gets done a little bit quicker, you can just spread those lines out further apart. What I love about it is there's no wrong choice. If you love the look of Paisleys but don't want to include that meandering line, you can totally leave that part out, just by quilting Paisleys and using echoing to maneuver your way around. The Meandering Paisley uses the same basic shapes that are in our scooped feathers. Now we've already seen how to quilt that scooped feather design in an earlier video, and we saw how to quilt it in those thinner borders and sashings. But it's also a great option for those bigger areas. So let me show you how to quilt that scooped feather in bigger borders on the Longarm quilting machine. Instead of quilting one big design that wraps around the border, I'm going to quilt several smaller designs that follow an angle, basically taking that bigger border and breaking it up into smaller, more manageable pieces. I showed you how to quilt this design in an earlier video, so if you haven't watched that, be sure to go back and check that out. Basically, I'm quilting this thinner feather design in sections by quilting a curve, filling it in with those petals, and then changing direction until I have a design that fills in that area. From here, I'm simply going to travel along the edge of my area and repeat, quilting that same shape so it's next to the previously quilted one. But even if I end up with a bigger gap in between those designs, I know that I can always go back and add some echoing to fill it in. And if I have any gaps in between my rows, I'm going to go ahead and fill it in while I'm there. I like to use echoing to do this, but you could use any design that you like. Then, once I have my second row finished, I'm going to repeat, traveling along the edge and doing the same thing. The reason I like quilting these designs on an angle is that it gives me a little bit more room than just quilting it horizontally. As you're quilting the design, try not to stress out about the individual rows of this design. Even if one of them is bigger or littler than another, once it's all filled in, all you're going to see is that beautiful all over kind of curvy look. As I fill in the first side of my border, once I approach that inner border corner, I know that the next one is going to go directly across that area. But even though I'm quilting a longer design, I'm still going to go about the same way as I did before, quilting my sections, echoing around, and continuing on. And I'm just eyeballing the design as I'm quilting it, but if you wanted to make it more precise, you could use your marking tool to mark some guidelines to follow. But like I said, even if the designs aren't perfectly placed or even perfectly straight, once it's all filled in, it's going to look great. And then as I fill in that border corner with more of the designs, they're going to get shorter and shorter until I don't have very much room left at all. At that point, I'm just going to throw in some paisleys or petal shapes to fill it in. Once that border corner is all filled in, I can simply travel along the edge of the border and resume working my way down the other side. There's just something about taking a design that works well in one part of your quilt and adapting it to another. For an even more feathery look for your background areas, try quilting the Feather Meander. Now, we've seen this one before in prior videos, but it is one of those classic versatile designs that work great everywhere. We're going to learn how to quilt the design in background areas, and I'm also going to show you how to adapt it to borders as well. So this design starts with a swirl, a line that curls in on itself, stopping when I reach the center. Now I'm making sure to leave some space in between the lines of that swirl because from this point, I'm going to work my way back out quilting petals. So from here, I'm going to quilt that half heart shape so that it looks like it's merging into the spine and continuing on so that they work their way all the way back to the starting point. Now as you're quilting this design, it's not the size of the swirl that will determine the density of your quilting, it's the size of those petals. So don't feel like you have to quilt that swirl really big or really small because that's not the part that matters. And there I have my adorable first little feathered swirl. So from here, I want to quilt another feathered swirl. But to help me branch off of the first one, I'm going to use some echoing. So I'm going to work my way around those petals until I get to the point where I want to add my next one. Then once I'm ready, I can stop echoing and quilt my next swirl. Stopping in the center and then quilting those petals, working my way back out. As I'm quilting those petals, the ones inside the swirl will tend to be a little bit smaller because there's not quite as much room. But as I work my way around the outside of that swirl, I'm really going to quilt them so they extend out into that area. Then once that one's done, I'm going to again use echoing to help me maneuver my way around that area. If I get to a point where I don't have quite enough room for a whole feathered swirl, I can just add some teardrops or some paisley kind of shapes to fill it in and then move on. Now the hardest part about quilting this design is dealing with gaps in between the feathers as well as in between the feathers and the outside of our area. The trick to remember is I just need to fill in that area. It doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be the same thing, it just needs to be filled in. I can add some more echoing, I can add a different design altogether, whatever it takes to fill it in and move on. And if I find myself stuck at any point, I can just travel along the edge of the area and get out of there. So if this design seems a little bit tricky, don't worry. I put together some free quilting diagrams that will show you how it goes together. I'll tell you more about those at the end of the video. Now let's talk about some common frustrations with this design. First off, knowing which way to quilt those petals from the center. Once I get to the center of my swirl, I'm going to start quilting my petals, but I want them to extend out towards the direction that we're heading. So for instance, if I'm looking right here, my petals are going to point out this way because this is the direction that I'm heading. I'm also working my way around the bigger part of that swirl. Sometimes what can happen is we can quilt that swirl and then start quilting our petals along the inside of it. There's nothing wrong with that. The only tricky thing is I'm going to run out of room. And I might get a shape that looks a little bit like this. If that happens, do not stop. Just keep on going, adding echoing, filling in that area, and moving on. Even though it's not technically how I quilted the other one, I think it still looks great. Depending on the size of that swirl, you'll have more or less feathers on your petal, and that's totally fine. They don't all have to have the same amount. Some of mine might have 3 or 4, some might have even more or even less. It really doesn't matter. Another thing that will help you with this design is to keep that initial swirl nice and round. I don't necessarily want one that's really strung out because it makes it a little bit more tricky to fill in around it. I want to keep it about the size of a quarter or a half dollar. That way, as I add my petals and work my way back out, it's going to fill in that center and let me move on without having to come back and deal with it. As opposed to quilting a swirl that's like this. Because as I start adding my petals around it, I'm going to have some gaps that I need to come back and fill in. Again, it's not the end of the world, it's just one more thing to think about. If this happens, I'm just going to work my way back around, add some echoing, add some more filler in there, and move on. Now, if you've tried quilting this design over and over again to no avail, you might find a stencil helpful. Stencils are a great tool for learning new designs since you have that path that you can follow. I designed this stencil to help you quilt that feather meander design in rows across your background area or even as a border design. Simply place a stencil on your quilt and mark out the lines using a pounce pad or a water-soluble marker. And the registration circles on the stencil make it easy to quickly reposition and continue marking. Once I've got the stencil all marked, I'm simply going to quilt along the lines to create my beautiful feather meander. And as you're quilting, don't stress so much about keeping it directly on the lines. Instead, focus on keeping the line nice and smooth. Even if it veers off the marked line a little bit, once we remove all those markings, you're not going to even know where it was supposed to be. And to help you get that nice, smooth line, try looking ahead of the needle in the direction you're heading. It'll help you see where the line's going and give you time to adjust as you're quilting. And don't let all the echo lines throw you off. Not only do they help build up the design, they help show off the beautiful individual feathers of the quilting. And as you're quilting, if you're not sure where to go next, you can always pause and use your fingers to trace out the next couple of steps. And you can find the stencil on our website by clicking the link in the description box below or by visiting quiltingismytherapy.com. Using a stencil is just a great way to learn how the design goes together and create beautiful quilting for your quilts. When quilting a feather meander, you can change up the look of the design simply by changing up the feather. Instead of quilting a round, curvy feather, I'm going to quilt one that's a little bit straighter, that extends out into the area. Then once I have that feather, I'm going to use echoing and a different design to fill in the rest of the area. I think the hardest part about this design is wrapping your head around switching back and forth between the feather and the filler. But if you can get your mind to wrap around that, it's a really fun way to transition into more custom looking feathers. Echoing around the feather not only helps separate it from the rest of the filler, it helps me maneuver my way around the area so I can fill in all those gaps before I move on. And you can use any design to fill around those feathers. I'm quilting a swirl shape because it's one of my favorites. But if you wanted to, you could quilt pebbles or meandering lines or even smaller feathers. Once I filled in around that first feather, I can then quilt my next feather. And since I want this to look like a meander, I'm gonna quilt all my feathers so that they're different shapes and going in different directions. I love seeing the pop of feathers in the design, but I just don't want them to go in one direction where it starts to look like a border design. I'm quilting the variation of the feather where I quilt the petals from the bottom up, but you can really change up the look of this design by quilting a different feather altogether. And just like we saw earlier, once I have that feather quilted, I'm going to use echoing and a filler design to fill in any of those gaps. And who says you have to only just use one feather? Quilting the meander and throwing in different feather shapes is only going to add interest and beauty to your quilting. Plus, it's a great way to try out different feather shapes without committing to using them over a whole area. And as you're quilting this design, you might find that you have tons of feathers and a little bit of filler, or you might have more filler and just a fewer feathers. Either way is totally fine. You're still gonna get that beautiful feathery look to your quilting. I love how this design is so much fun to quilt. It not only looks great, it adds beautiful interest to the background areas of your quilt. The feather meander is beautiful in background areas, but it also works in borders as well, especially wider borders like this. I'm still going to quilt the same shape. The only difference is I'm going to quilt them all in a row instead of going in all different directions. So I'm going to start by quilting that first swirl so that's centered on the border as much as possible. Then from here, I'm going to work my way back out, quilting those petal shapes until I get back to the starting point. Then I'm going to echo around that feather until I get out in front of it so I can add my next one. Now, just as we saw in that all over design, I'm going to get some gaps in between those feathers. I'm going to go ahead and use echoing to fill those in before I move on. Then, once I'm ready to branch off and add my next one, I'm going to again use echoing to get out in front of it and quilt my next one. Now, normally when quilting these petals, I extend them all the way out into the area. But in this case, this side is actually the outside of my quilt. I'm going to need to leave a little bit of a gap in between the petal and the edge. That way, when I come back later and trim it up and add the binding, it doesn't cut off those petals. But since this side of the border is towards the inside of the quilt, I can extend my petals all the way out to the edge on this side. Now, obviously, I like to come back and fill in these gaps while I'm here. But if you wanted to, you could leave those all to the end and then do them all at once. It's totally up to you. Now, as I'm quilting these feathered swirls, I'm not concerned with which direction they're facing. They might all face the same direction, they might alternate direction. I'm totally not worried about that. And as you're quilting those feathers, if you want, you can actually pause in between the petals, come back and add your echoing, and then resume. You might find it a little bit more efficient to do it that way, or you might prefer quilting all your petals and then working your way back. Either one is great. Not only does this design look great in borders, you might find it easier to quilt in a row like this as opposed to going in all different directions. I just love using the same design in different ways on our quilts. Not only does it give a little bit of repetition to the quilting, but it makes them nice and versatile. Now it's your turn. If you're quilting along with me on the panel I designed just for the video series, go ahead and fill in the areas highlighted in red with the designs of your choice. You can try practicing the designs that we learned in the video, or you can try creating your own designs. Either way, it's going to look amazing on your quilt. And as always, I've put together some free quilting diagrams to help you be successful with the techniques that we're learning in these videos. Or you can check out our expanded resource PDF with even more step-by-step instructions, quilted samples, and tips. For under $10, it's going to have everything you need to be successful with the designs that we're learning throughout this video series. I'll be back soon with the next video in the series, where we're going to learn 2 more designs for backgrounds and borders. Until then, everybody, happy quilting!